Good morning, everybody. It's still morning for a couple of minutes. So it's a pleasure and honor, obviously, for me to be here and to present to you the ICRC's, the International Humanitarian Red Cross's Humanitarian Impact Bond. My name is Tobias Epprecht. I've been with the ICRC for some 20 years. So personally, I don't have a financial background. So I came to this as a sort of a chef d'orchestre to bring the various parties together. But I'm happy, obviously, to share with you a bit the insights of what how this Humanitarian Impact Bond works, and then also what we've learned in all this. To give you a short sort of background, I think most of you know the International Red Cross. We work in 60, 70 contexts around the world. We have a current annual budget of roughly 2 billion Swiss francs. And with the needs growing, obviously also our need for additional resources continue to grow. The vast majority of the funding comes from governments, but obviously that also has its limits. So the ICRC for some time has been looking at different ways how to mobilize additional funding. And one of that stream was decided to say, okay, we look into what does innovative finance, what options offers this, and what can we learn from that? And that's a model that can complement the ICRC's funding on it. And so we've started, 3.5 years ago, something like that, in the thinking where we worked with a consultancy firm which advised us to look at the social impact model and to see to which extent we can adapt this to the environment where the ICRC is working in humanitarian context, but also for an organization like the ICRC, which has already a number of well-established processes, which obviously then guide the way we operate. It was also a decision then we had to choose what type of work we want to try to fund through this. We obviously needed to look at something that where we have data available, because we needed to build a baseline. Where there's also somehow a certain predictability. You can't implement that in emergency situations as such. So we've selected the physical rehabilitation program. Physical rehabilitation is providing prostheses, ortheses, wheelchairs to people, physical rehabilitation in contexts where the ICRC operates. To put it in context, we currently support roughly 130 such centers worldwide, but the needs, including all the other services which are provided by other service providers, vastly outnumber. So roughly probably 10% of actually the worldwide needs are covered by the services that are provided, and so the need is enormous. We've done then a call to our colleagues in the field and say, okay, identify where obviously additional needs are there. And we came back with quite a significant number of potential contexts over which we then built a certain number of feasibility studies. We'll come to that. So first, maybe quickly a word on the objectives of what we wanted to achieve this. And clearly, first and foremost, it's a humanitarian organization. So as I just mentioned, the needs are enormous. So to try to provide more such services was obviously fundamental. So that's first and foremost. As I said, currently 120, 130 centers. So the idea is to add additional one. At the same time, we have a 25-year experience in terms of providing such services. It's something which we do always together, or practically always together, with local partners, often Ministry of Health or the likes, Ministry of Social Welfare. And there's a lot of different ways of how you can, for instance, do outreach to try to bring more people to these physical rehabilitation centers. Ways of, from stock management and all that. And what the whole idea is also that during this time which we have available within the Humanitarian Impact Bond, that we try to systematically analyze, okay, what works and what works even better, to try to come up with a sort of a blueprint, or some call it a cookbook or a recipe book. Say, okay, if you want to address certain issues, okay, these are typical measures which have proven to work. I'll come to that, how we actually implement that. And at the same time, also to try to improve and to bring digitalization also to the field and the context, and to provide a better management tool for the centers in the field. And then there's a couple of objectives which are related more for the ICRC's fundraising. As I said, okay, first is obviously we currently receive the vast majority of our funds on an annual basis, but to see, okay, how can we tap into multi-year funding, have some predictability, and through that, provide more guarantee and assurance in terms of the longer-term sustainability of the programs. At the same time, obviously provide an opportunity for private capital to support humanitarian activities, as well as then to build partnerships. And last but not least, and we've always stressed, it is a pilot project. It's something new where we want to learn from this. As I said at the beginning, what are the opportunities and the challenges such financing instruments offer, and what do we need to adapt internally in order to be able to be fit to play in that market. I'll now walk you through a bit how this whole thing actually works, to give you a bit more detail. It all starts with the outcome funders, with which we've signed a payment by results agreements, where they essentially make a pledge that in 5 years' time, they will pay the ICRC for certain results achieved according to a clearly defined program. I'll get to that. Based on this insurance that in 5 years' time money comes in, the insurers, the insurance, yes, there's an insurance company involved, but the social investors, they make essentially an investment. And as Tobias said, these are not bonds, these are essentially investments which were made. So the investments, they come in 2 installments, provide the money to the ICRC, which then has the resources to implement, in this case, the respective services in the contexts Mali, Nigeria, and Kinshasa. And again, in all of these places, that's together with a local partner. Now, concretely, what will we be doing? It's split in 2 specific phases. The first phase includes the training of the staff, people which will equip, essentially, which will staff these centers, which will be trained over the first 3 years. The centers need to be built. That's something that's currently ongoing. And then the third element, as I mentioned before, it's the whole testing of the efficiency measures, where in 8 existing centers, where the ICRC is currently working, that we say, okay, we change certain aspects and see, okay, what impact that has in terms of the efficiency of the overall centers, as I mentioned, for instance, outreach, for instance, the way the patient flow works inside, and administrative issues, to see, okay, how do we improve and try to render these centers as efficient, as effective as possible, provided the limited resources to have. And then at the end of it, sort of towards the end of the 3rd year, that you have all those 3 elements that come together, the new staff, the new centers, as well as obviously the knowledge which we gained through the first years, and then enable to run and operate these new centers according to that. What I need to say, but before this, obviously there was a phase 0. That's where the whole build part of the whole construct, but it's also during that period where we've looked at and established the baseline. The baseline is essentially where we try to look for comparable centers, which the ICRC has started to support or rebuild. And then, okay, what was the outcome during that first 2 years of operation? And then compare this, sorry, I've missed the section, but I'll get to that. Compare this with the last year of operations. So that's the 5th year of the operation of the program, or the 2nd year of the operation of the centers, which will then essentially determine the success or the failure of the program, if you want, where the efficiency of these centers will be compared to the baseline which we've established at the beginning. What I wanted to mention before is that obviously during the whole period, during these 5 years, We maintain a regular contact with the outcome funders as well as with the social investors. This happens through bilateral reporting, which on a quarterly basis, but also then regular meetings on every 6 months, where the outcome funders and the social investors obviously have the opportunity to provide in their input and perspectives in terms of how the ICRC carries out this program. The overall or the end responsibility remains with the ICRC, sort of the decision making, okay, what we actually do is with the ICRC, but the input that comes is clearly guided, obviously also by various partners in it. What happens in the last year is that, as I said, what actually then determines the success of these programs, and that's obviously what then needs to be evaluated by the external parties. So we have an external verification provider, as we call them, which will go then to the field to actually verify that the results that the ICRC has reported match with the reality, and it's not something that we have made up in our little corner. And this is then reported directly to the outcome funders as well as the social investors, which then in turn, at the end of the 5th year, will trigger the payment by results agreement, which has been signed initially between the outcome funders and the ICRC. So the money, and I'll come to the cash flow in the second stage, will then come to the ICRC, which then in turn will use that to repay the investors at the end of the 5th year. So that's a broad overview in terms of how the whole thing is structured. And it gives you an idea of. If we now look at, from a financial way, how the cash flow works and what happens. On one hand, obviously, you have the financial side, and the other part is the outcome measure. Outcome measure 1 essentially means that the efficiency of the new centers is exactly the same as the efficiency in the reference centers, in the baseline centers. 0.2 means obviously only an efficiency of 20% compared to historic. And then on the other end, it can go up to indefinite, but ours ends at 1.8, meaning that an efficiency of up to 80% increase overall the baseline is the upper end of the bandwidth within which this impact bond functions and also pays. First, what determines, we've established a budget for this entire program, which includes the training, which includes the building of the centers, which includes the testing of efficiency measures, but also afterwards, obviously, the operational part of it, which roughly at 20 million Swiss francs, which is funded, as I mentioned at the beginning, by a certain number of social investors who've put in the vast majority of it. And as I said, the money came in at the signature of it, which was in July of last year. And the second part of the second tranche will come in towards July of 2018, which then gives the ICRC the money and able to carry out the program. You'll see there's a little gap at the bottom. It actually is filled by a contribution by the La Caixa Foundation, which was one of the outcome funders, which makes a conditional payment at the end of the 3rd year based on the fact if the centers are actually built or not. With all that, we will come up to the total of the roughly 20 millions which we need to run this program throughout the year. As I mentioned, at the 5th year, after the verification has been done, it determines what do the outcome funders, what essentially is the bill towards the outcome funders at the end of it. And that determines very much, obviously, on the results. That can go from, if the results are disastrous, that nothing has, there's a zero, meaning that essentially there's no outcome at the end of the 3rd year, which is hopefully not the case, all the way up to the other end of an 80% increase of efficiency. Reality is that there's probably going to be some money left over. All the more so if we have a sort of a worst case scenario, meaning that the likelihood that nothing, there's a zero outcome can only happen if there's some dramatic incidents that the ICRC would have never been able to build these centers because, take an example, it's been expelled from the country and through that would never have been able. So there's obviously more likely to be money left over. So that would obviously reduce then the bill that would go to the outcome funders proportionally. But that's not something which we can foresee, but it's foreseen in the contracts as such that these resources would remain available. So that gives you the idea what the bills which would go to the outcome funder. There's another element which was included is sort of the skin in the game, as they call it, or the risk what the ICRC needs to carry, the incentives that we try to make sure that we at least raise part. That's part of the thing which a request mostly from the social investors, which wanted to see that there is somehow an incentive that the ICRC makes sure that there is a concrete output, so that in case we perform or the centers perform below par, the ICRC has a risk of 10% of the overall amount, so roughly 2 million Swiss francs, which is you can say at risk, which we would have to find through other ways, which we would have to contribute in order to make it to the last line, which is essentially the return payment to the social investors. What is left, the light blue, is obviously the potential loss of a social investor in case the performance is below par. Anything above is obviously the potential return. To give you an idea, so you have the capital guarantee is essentially at 60% for the social investors. On the upper end, we talk about an IRR of 7% in case of a 80% increase of the efficiency compared to historical centers, which is very ambitious, but okay. As Toby said, that's going to be the 5 cats or the 8 cats which we find in the dark room. It goes to your day. A couple of words on lessons learned. It's been a pilot project. I call it sort of with all its ups and downs. Obviously, when we started, to put it quite bluntly, we did not know what we were doing. Or what we were getting ourselves into, probably more correctly. And I think that was the case for a lot of the partners involved in it as well. So it required a considerable political will from all involved to say, okay, we take that risk, we take the step, we don't know yet where that journey will bring us. The road was anything but straight. There were a lot of hiccups on the way, and then several times a lot of people said, okay, this is never gonna fly. But on the positive side of it, because there was this political will from a lot of parties, everybody was prepared to say, okay, we'll make a compromise here and we'll adapt to there what we probably not could do if that were a business as usual case. I'm speaking also more particularly for the ICRC in this case. Just to give you an example, our system does not allow us to do a 5-year budget. We can do a 5-year budget on a financial perspective, what we assume that it will need. But from an analytical perspective, the system is not made set up. So, okay, that's something we had then to invent, and essentially we have a budget on an Excel sheet, which runs parallel to it. It's something which we can allow ourselves to do once for this project to see, okay, to do the lessons learned of it, but it's not obviously something that is viable and would require a significant change in terms of the organization. Similar for outcome funders, to give you an example, I mean, Belgians, they had to adjust their legislations. They had to change the legislations to even be able to support the ICRC in that project. And for Switzerland, it was also a moment that required significant political input and strong words to say, okay, yes, we're doing it, because maybe it does not fit in the box as the boxes are created today, so that required a bit of additional right. I also don't hide how challenging it was to negotiate the contract between 4 governments and a certain number of social investors, but just 4 governments, each with its own, again, rules and regulations. And at the end of the day, you want one contract which with all for the same party. So by the time you get the feedback from one, the contract has already evolved because you get feedback from somebody else. And so it's not an easy thing. And certainly in terms from a lessons learned perspective, there we need to find a way, if we go around that similar track again, that we find a system that does not necessarily require such a type of negotiations as we've done it. And again, because it was a joint building of it, that comes with it. It's also I have another point which I wanted to mention here. It just slipped my mind. Forgive me for a second. We've built this thing the wrong way around, to put it quite bluntly. We've started with we say, okay, we want to build an impact bond. We've looked at which problem we want to solve with it. We've selected the physical rehabilitation in terms of how, I explained to you how we came about. And then essentially went to the outcome funders and tried to find the social investors. And then obviously, this did really fit within what they were interested in, were ready to fund. It was necessary because it's only like that we could do the learning exercise. But if I say we did it the wrong way around, obviously today if we start to look at, okay, what is the problem the ICRC wants to address through an innovative financing project and not through its traditional funders? What are the advantages of such an an impact bond, for instance, the multi-year funding or others? And at the same time, what type of outcome funders are prepared, where there's even money available to support that type of projects, and only then you build the program or the project around it, and not the other way around. So that's why I say we took the thing the wrong way around in terms of lessons learned. Certainly something which again, was necessary for us to know what we at the end of the day were doing, but today we would certainly go differently about it. Data, as was mentioned before, it's all about data. I mean, the ICRC has collected data and is measuring its work throughout the years. That's as we've done. But to have reliable data, which we then can build a predictable, to build a baseline over it, it's something which we also still need to work on in terms of to become more systematic in terms of how we collect data and how we actually measure our current programs in order to build potential similar products. And outcome measure, how do you do something as complex as, which involves over 5 years from building to training to testing new ways of doing, to building an ICT tool, all the way to running a project in 3 different countries, which each very different. How do you boil that down to essentially one figure, which at the end of the day determines the success or the failure of a program? So you can make fairly complicated formulas, which have a number of variables, and the outcome measure, which the ICRC, and together with COIS has established, is on one hand fairly complex because it looks at how many prostheses and ortheses and wheelchairs have been delivered or successfully delivered to enable to render these people mobile again, if you want, per professional staff in the center, and there again weighted by the capacity and by their training, by the working hours. So already quite complex, but if you look at it, it still only essentially measures the outcome of the center, but does not include physical rehabilitation which is necessary in order for the people to successfully discharge, but how do you boil this down to one figure which is essentially measurable and also uncontestable at the end of the day? So that is a challenge which we, I think we need to be conscious of when we build these sort of things, that they're complex, and at the same time you don't want to have a too complex of a formula, because if you want to go then to the market with it, if the investors look at it and say, look, I didn't understand a third of this, then there's no way that there is any chance that this will be successful. Scale was mentioned. We've aimed higher. We've aimed initially to build 5 centers. The reality was that even after extended various outreaches, mostly to outcome funders, that we had to limit ourselves in this case to 3. Scale, it was on a very complex endeavor, so it was not a cheap one. So certainly it was not something which we would say, okay, we can simply replicate like that. So if we need to, we want to do, it cannot be at a 20 or a 30 million size. It needs to be at a 200 to 300 million size to enable to make it viable, that the investment which you make in there, that it actually brings out. Now, are we capable of doing a 200 or a 300 million project? I think in terms of the needs, that is certainly unquestionable. The bigger question is, do you find the necessary outcome funders for it? And that's what the crux of it. Right? Looking a bit into the future, it was mentioned before, it's not one thing that should replace the other one. I mean, we clearly see that, but certainly from our perspective, we don't want to take the money out of one pocket and put it in the other one and make our lives complicated through that. But clearly the idea is that this opens opportunities and doors for new donors, for new outcome funders, which so far have not supported it, or which could not support the type of projects the way the vast majority of the government so far do, where they give us grants at the beginning and then we report afterwards. But clearly the aim is that does not replace it, but rather that we find additional resources for that. And I'll end with that. I say outcome funders, outcome funders, outcome funders. It's, to put it simplistic, that's the most challenging part of it. It's the finding the necessary resources to support this kind of projects. It was a challenge for the outcome funders, and here I'm mentioning, for instance, the humanitarian budgets. I'm not sure that they're necessarily adapted to the impact bond business, and maybe Mano will have something to say of that. But if we looked at the impact bond concept, which it started, the social impact bond in the UK, where you essentially see, okay, can you essentially at the end of the day for the government bring an efficiency into it, that you have less people going again through the system. So on the longer run, you make cost savings. You can put a price tag on the individuals in your, in this case, on the people detained, incarcerated. Humanitarian budgets don't work like that. The ICRC asks for an X amount of money to be able to carry out the project, which is clearly for a certain amount of people. But even if this project, which we are confident will be successful and will render more services to people than we previously have done, the needs are so large that it will not reduce essentially the requests to the outcome funders or to the traditional donors in the future, because it simply allows us to do more with the same resources, but not necessarily that we have less, that the costs overall for the outcome funders will reduce. So I'm not sure, that's why I'm saying that the humanitarian budget as such will be adapted to that. And committing budgets to the future, as somebody said, you essentially put a post-it on a future budget which you don't control yet today, and then say, okay, in 5 years' time we have made a commitment, but it's as a number of colleagues from governments told us that it's not the budget which we control today, and so clearly a challenge there, and for us it's therefore. Again, I'm coming back to the line before, it's not to replace existing donors or the way existing donors fund us, but rather to see, okay, does this open new opportunities, new doors to new donors, which we currently don't have access to. I want to stop here, leave you the opportunity to challenge the question. For various things which obviously can contribute. Do we need the microphones, or can we do it like this? I think we can, yeah. Okay?
I can shout. So my name is I'm from Medicines for Malaria Venture.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to ask you what kind of stick, if you want, or whip, did the private investor have to make sure that you accomplished those goals? In other words, were they member of overlooking the project, or how do they monitor the evolution of the project to make sure essentially that they made the return that they wish to make?
Yeah. Outcome funders as well as social investors, they're very much involved in what I call the phase 0. It's the phase before, during the building phase, where they obviously had a lot of questions, and I can name one of them. Munich Re is the biggest investor in the project. So they analyzed historical data, and they've run that through 50 million calculations to see, okay, what are the various risks involved and what's the probability of the outcome. So they've done the thorough risk analysis from their perspective for a start. They were involved during the discussions in terms of, okay, how the ICRC will run this. They've looked at historically how we've reacted to potential challenges down the road. But we've always been very clear that independence is one of the ICRC's fundamental principles, which we cannot compromise, in this case, for the sake of building the impact bond. So we clearly said that you have everything we can say, and you look at and contribute and question during the design phase. Once the actual program starts, they have a regular dialogue. I mean, we regularly report in terms of what's happening in the field, and I get regular questions, okay, why are the numbers here and why not there? There is the regular meetings which are put in place to give them this necessary confidence, but there is no possibility for the investor during the course of the project to essentially directly influence. The only whip, if you would call it, or the incentive, is what I've put in this phase here, is this red line. It's essentially what we call the skin in the game of the ICRC. So meaning that if we don't at least reach par, us as the ICRC, it will hurt us, it will cost us. So we'll need to find additional resources. So that's the thing which the investors wanted to see, that there is, otherwise we can sleep and do nothing, and we don't lose anything other than our reputation. So clearly our reputation is probably the biggest incentive. Now, how does how is that measured? But in terms of from a financial perspective, it's clearly that 10% skin in the game which the investors wanted to see, that we chip in case things don't work out as expected. No. Okay.
Hello, my name is Marcel Venoy. I work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Development Cooperation in the Netherlands. So we very much appreciate that your organization is doing this. We are one of the major supporters of your work.
And of this.
Although we're not among that list of outcome funders, and we appreciate the other governments, of course, doing this as well. My question is more or less similar. Could you be a bit more explicit about what is the internal incentive for ICRC staff to perform better in this project than in other projects, because that's what the scale is indicating.
Yep.
And related to that, have you thought about outsourcing part of the operations to others in order to have a bit of a broader experiment?
Okay, thank you. Yes, you do support this, even if you're not part of the outcome funders, but you supported the phase 0, which was very much important. So the incentives for our people to ensure that, or not the incentives or the whips or however you want to, there's no system in place as such, other than the eternal motivation, and now I say of our staff, to try to do the best for the people which we work. And I think that's the fundamental motivation which I would hope the vast majority of our staff have, why they work for our organization. But it helps to put in place an evidence-based analysis of, okay, what works best? Not just, oh, I've done it this way and I know it's better than your system you're doing in your other country. But now, during the first 3 years of trying to actually look at these efficiency measures and say, okay, now we actually take the time and put the resources in place that we test this and see, okay, what works and what works better under which circumstances, that you can have an evidence base and say, okay, look, now it's not anymore you can choose, pick or choose, but okay, that's the way we implement the services or run these centers in order to ensure to be as efficient as possible. So it's clearly, on one hand, to analyze this and then to put in place respective protocols to ensure that. And then it's the oversight and regular monitoring which we have in place for all other programs. But fundamentally, it is also obviously to do more better. And I think knowing from the field as well as from the headquarters, our colleagues in the field, they always want to do more. And we are the one at the headquarters have to say, sorry, no, you have to cut here and we can't do more like that. So I'm speaking now from an internal perspective. I don't necessarily, I'm too much afraid of that aspect. The second part of your question was outsourcing. As I said, all these projects are done in partnerships with the respective local partner, Ministry of Health and the likes. So while we maintain the actual responsibility in order to ensure that we are accountable for it, the staff which is deployed is not ICRC staff. It's staff which belongs to the ministry, the respective ministry. The buildings are built, paid by the ICRC, but at the end of the day, the ownership. So it's a partnership based and ruled by a memorandum of understanding between the local partner and the ICRC. So we're not purely alone of it. Now, if we would have wanted to outsource this and essentially subcontract another entity, it's not a way the ICRC generally works in none of its programs. It's one of the things where we say, okay, we are the service provider all the way to the end, and different to other humanitarian organizations, more the UN system, which then has a certain number of implementing partners, but it's not something which the ICRC has in place as such, and I don't think it's something which, at least at this stage, would it. Now, if we go and look at scale, look in the future, it's potentially models which we could look at, but certainly for the first one, we said, okay, no, we need to have the control all the way to the end, and it's also something which the various outcome funders, they wanted to be very sure that it's the ICRC who actually does it and not just at some stage, not us anymore. Yeah, I'm perfectly fine. I don't know how it is for the recording. I need a microphone, sorry. Okay.
Sorry. Hi. My name is Debra Heavenstone. I work as a professor lecturer at the Bern University of Applied Sciences. First, I just want to thank you for the talk. It's impressive to hear about the work of the Red Cross, and one only feels guilty. I feel guilty that I've never contributed when I hear such a talk. Maybe something I should change. Anyway, so you started your talk saying that you have 25 years experience and 130 centers. And in the course of your responses in your talk, you said, our employees feel motivated by stewardship and belief in the mission, and we value our independence.
Yep.
And at the startup, you kind of introduced it as what was new for us here was the financing. But if we think about the talks this morning, when they talk about SIBs, they say what's new for us is we inspire new, better programming.
Yep.
And so my question to you is, with 25 years experience in 130 centers, what was new about your programming? From your talk so far, I have maybe gathered that some of the data collection and monitoring was new, but was there anything else new, or was it just as good as the wonderful work that the Red Cross does anyway?
I think what's certainly new is to try, as I said, to come up with KPIs, with a measure, and say, okay, how do we look at the way we carry out this program? How do we actually measure this? So data was available in terms of, okay, how many people have been serviced and what type of staff, and quite a vast amount of data. But that we actually looked at this data and say, okay, what does this data tell us? That was never done. So it forced us, when we looked at this vast amount of data, and say, okay, what is the pattern that it shows us? And say, okay, what do we learn from it? And again, I'm not the specialist in physical rehabilitation, but my colleagues clearly said, oh, well, okay, I have a clear explanation for that, but I've never seen it in that sense. So that's the first one, to already look at historically what that tells us. And then at the same time of saying, okay, now we have put in place an actual robust measuring system, which we can see, okay, how does this affect our work in the future? And then to see that we actually have now in place a system. The monitoring system, yes, but not necessarily on the way we've looked at and we've analyzed this data, and say, okay, what can we learn from that? And then through that also to bring, again, efficiency and effectiveness to the centers and render these centers more efficiently. And obviously all what we've learned now here has an impact on the 3 centers directly, but we'd be fools if we don't use that for the 127 other centers which are out there. So it has a long-term collateral positive effect on the overall program, and therefore, yeah, I think that's clearly the motivation and the innovative part of it, to try to bring this further.
Raymond for SECO. You emphasized that this HIB is complementary to the traditional funding scheme that you have, and it's not substitutional. Now, saying that is the right thing indeed, but how do you mitigate that still it's not going to happen that way, that your traditional funders will say, well, just shop around sufficiently long and you will find these providers and we can do less at some point. Do you have any additional measures than just to communicate and state that it should not be substitutional?
When we've started it, the idea was obviously, the fundamental idea is that this would allow us to tap into new resources, actually to new outcome funders. That this would open the doors to new parties. And we've gone around, and reality was there was a big interest, but to try to marry a new partner, a new outcome funder, to the ICRC, which they don't know us, we don't know them, with their own system, with a product, a new product, which we, put it again bluntly, we didn't even know what exactly it will look like, was most likely a recipe for failure. So we've ended up with what I call the usual suspects in this first round, which had the trust and the confidence in the ICRC, at least from a programmatic perspective, and which understood how the ICRC worked, that we should be capable of carrying this out, but then could concentrate more on to prove the concept of it. You see what I mean? Now, there it is essentially trust that when the Swiss SDC tells us that this 10 million, up to 10 million will be complemented and not as in place of what you would get, I say now anyway. Yes, I mean, that's more for the SEC to answer. But looking at the future, for us, it's clearly that this concept has proven to work in the humanitarian environment. Now that this opens the doors, not again for the usual suspects, but for those which we so far have not access to, who said, okay, I'm not prepared to give you a grant the way the vast majority flows to the ICRC currently at this stage, but I'm prepared to pay for concrete results in, be it physical rehabilitation, being water and sanitation, or any other business, but which opens new doors which otherwise the ICRC does not have access. So it's only through that in terms of enabling to access new partners, new donors, which otherwise we would not have access to. Please.
Excuse me, one second.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. Anna Wellenstein from the World Bank. Thank you for the presentation. Two brief questions. So the other side of what my colleague asked, on the social investor side, what kind of social investors were there, and how did ICRC develop those relationships? And if you could just then spend a minute saying a bit more specifically what your efficiency measures used were. Thank you.
Okay. Social investors, as I mentioned, the biggest one is Munich Re or New Re, reinsurance company, which we've essentially approached for a different reason. The question was, okay, how much capital guarantee can we provide considering a potential, the uplift on the other hand? And so one thinking during the whole is, okay, is that something which we want to insure? And then they turned around and says, I want to invest and I don't want to insure. So, but that was a pure coincidence in terms of it. And for them, it's a new product, which they say, okay, they look at it as a risk management as well, because it's just, the cash flow is differently for them, but so that's one, that's the cornerstone investor. And then we've worked with Banque Lombard-Odier, who've known the ICRC historically, have been supporting the ICRC for a number of years. And they've essentially then sourced the remaining investors through their network who would be interested in it. So it's not the ICRC who's been out there in the corner to try to investors, but clearly it's one a bit of a chance, and the other one is together with Lombard-Odier. Okay. And the second question in terms of the measure, or how exactly we measure this, or? What did you measure? Because you mentioned. Yeah, okay. Yep. What we measure essentially at the outcome is how many people have successfully left the center, equipped again to be able to do basic tasks as one could expect a person to do, which has single or double amputee, can walk up the stairs again, pick up things, do the normal daily work, again, provided obviously in view of the visibility the person had, but nevertheless what can be expected with the mobile device which has been fitted. So that's one factor. Per professional staff employed in the center, and that's actually working on providing the physical rehabilitation services, so that delivers these devices. So, and then there are a number of factors that one device counts differently than another one, because a prothesis doesn't take as much, or an orthesis doesn't take as much time as a prothesis, and the wheelchair again differently. To weigh that, and as well for the staff, there have been a certain balance. And so that's a significant work that has been done previously to see, okay, what does the data shown us exactly in terms of it? In order to ensure that we don't introduce negative incentives, that the people only do the easy ones, and because to produce numbers, but that, everything is treated equal, pondering it according to its respective weights, again, based on the historic data which we have. And again, everything contributes to it. So for instance, physical rehabilitation service, so the actual training of the working with the staff with the patients, at the end of it, this is not measured as such, but a person can only successfully leave the center, but they have to go through a test at the end of it, that they actually are capable of doing this. And only once they successfully discharged are they counted in the statistics. Yeah. So that's sort of to ensure the overall of it.
5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? Good. Please. Okay, sorry now. Ladies first, and then one last question. Is that okay? Yeah, then Manuel as well. Microphone. We have only one microphone? Ah, sorry. Sorry, I didn't see who's getting the microphone. Okay, quick.
Cristina Dopasso from Medicine for Malaria Venture. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I would like to continue on the question from the lady from the World Bank. Do you know at any point who are the network, the social investors that are investing in your project from Lombardier? Is there a visibility also from your side? And what other traditional donors think about this new type of investment? And my second question is, looking at this this budget, is what you call the outcome funders, why do they wait for 5 years to invest in your project with 26 million when your project costs 20 million? And also, what is the cash left over?
Okay. First question, yes, we have full transparency. We obviously know who the investors are. So we have clear procedures in place in terms of what type of donations we accept, but also in this case, okay, what type of investors we can accept from a reputational perspective. So we have a clear visibility on that, and they have gone through the necessary screening processes. Second question, I think I will then make a link directly to Manuel, which may be answer what's the interest of the outcome funders to support this instead of me giving it. But the difference between the 26 and the 20 million, yeah, it's the transfer of risks. Yeah, if you look at this graph here, the 26, that's at the upper end. So if, in case we have a 80% improvement of the overall efficiency, so if quasi our centers are twice as efficient, and again, the idea is obviously, the assumption is that the centers will not stop after 5 years, they will continue. So the long-term benefit will go beyond, way beyond these 3 centers in terms of time, but also in terms of scope, because the impact is positive. But in case we have an 80% increase of efficiency over the way we've done things traditionally, well, that has its costs. But since there is obviously a risk at the other hand, that things can go wrong, the outcome funders, they only pay in case things are positive, because the moment we go into the negative area, part of the actual real costs, which is the 20 million, assuming that everything goes according to budget, part of it is then covered by the loss essentially of the investor. So it's the other side of it. And what is cash left over? Cash left over is simply that we say, okay, we've made a budget. We assume that it's going to cost us for 20 million. If it costs us more, the ICRC needs to find our own resources, but it's unlikely going to cost exactly 19.75 million. It's probably going to cost either more or less. We assume that it's probably going to cost a little bit less, so there's money left over. And the outcome funders were clear, said, look, if there's money left over, you can't just simply pocket this, but this needs to go back into the system, so meaning that it reduces the bill for the outcome funders, for those who pay the bills at the end. So assuming, again, if we go all the way to the left, if some catastrophic things happens that we don't have access to the centers don't produce, it's very likely that a significant amount of money is left. So it would be wrong then we sit on a pile of cash, send the bill to the outcome funder to pay something that has never been delivered in order to pay back investors. So that's the cash left over. It has to be accounted in at the end. Yeah. Oh, I have 2 more minutes, yeah.
Hi, I'm Max Bauder from Instiglio. First of all, I want to applaud you. I think this is the biggest impact bond so far in a developing country, so in terms of going to scale. What I think is even more interesting about the project is that you have this 3 to 4 year incubation period where you can increase your efficiency, and that's very unusual, and it's amazing that you got your donors to agree to this, or the outcome funders in this case. What I was wondering about is if you can talk a little bit more about this period and how you're actually planning on increasing your efficiency. And I was also interested in terms of efficiency gains, if you could talk a little bit more about the outcome measure that you have. Because my understanding would be that if you're just measuring the number of patients over the amount of money that you're actually getting, that would be a very good efficiency measure. And instead, it seems like you're always prescribing a little bit how you deliver the program, because if you do it over the number of staff, right, you're already kind of saying this is the delivery mechanism in terms of, like, for instance, substituting labor for capital in your intervention. So just having it tied to the number of patients that leave the facility successfully would have gotten you a lot more flexibility in terms of changing your approach, and would have already automatically would have been an efficiency measure given that you're spending a certain amount of money. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit about this period and what you're planning on doing there, and how the outcome measure is helping you or perhaps hindering you in a little bit as well. Thank you.
Okay, what's done? Okay, I could spend another hour in terms of what's going to be done over during the testing of the efficiency measures, but it's essentially we've looked at what are the various ways that influence the well-functioning of a center? You know, what are the various factors? And I said, okay, that can go from stock management, internal patient flow, to the point of what type of outreach do we do? Do we, for instance, in some places we have mobile units which go out to do potential repairs or smaller things, or do we transfer money that the people can come to the center which otherwise don't have? So there's different ways of it. So what's happening during these first 3 years, that we essentially in existing centers where we have established a way of working and where we have know what essentially the efficiency of the centers, we change one element of it and then see, okay, what does this bring? What impact does this have? Does it positive, negative, or whatever? So on a whole range, so I said 6 families, but there are 20 different possible measures which we've identified. We test a certain number of things and then see the change, the impact that has. So does that answer that part of the question? In terms of, again, what I said, okay, what do we boil it down to? We could have put it over money instead of over staff, but reality is that the situation is so fundamentally different between one context and another, and what we don't want either is essentially to put a price tag on an individual for this sort of thing, because it would lead down the wrong road, because you suddenly say, oh yeah, these people are much cheaper than this and I'll spend there and whatever, and the needs for the people are exactly the same thing. What they want is then essentially to be able to move again. Now that in one context it costs more than potentially in another one, there are a lot of external factors which we don't control, but we don't want to essentially have the price tag on the individual, which then determines where we allocate money or not on it. So it's the aim is to have people mobile again, and obviously as efficiently as possible, so that the limited resources serve more people. Yeah. Manuel, do you want the last word?
Perhaps if we still have time.
Or is
My name is Mano. I'm from Swiss Humanitarian Aid, and indeed, perhaps 2 or 3 words why we help with this mechanism. First of all, the interest to find new mechanisms of financing. Also, we are stretched, if not to say overstretched, and it is still a bit of an experiment with the ICRC. Even based on the long relationship between Switzerland and the ICRC, and it's our biggest partner in humanitarian terms, ICRC, it was an uphill battle also for Switzerland. The major issue was this part here. Mm-hmm. You know, why and how humanitarian funds should be used to pay benefits. We had to adapt the interpretation of our law for subsidies. Because according to the law, we are allowed to buy tents and kitchen sets and food, but not to pay private investors their benefit. And we will we had already like quite animated discussions, and we are depending on the help of the parliamentarians to counter them and to sort of bring them to in the right direction. But parliamentarians asking us how it is possible that you use Swiss taxpayers' money to pay to Munich Re or to Lombardier. So that's actually at this stage one of our main challenge. We will follow this very closely. We'll be very much engaged in this quarterly or 6 months union and or get together in order to see where we are going. It's a pilot indeed. Challenge is of course also I can relatively easily sign what most probably my successor in 5 years will have to pay, you know. At the handover, I will have to tell him or her, listen, there is something, one of these skeletons in the closet. Our budgets, as a lot of humanitarian budgets, are done on an annual basis. And 5 years from now to say, yes, 10 million, this needs also a good relationship between the partner, between ICRC and Switzerland. Yes, it is sort of the fundament of this common enterprise. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.